Hello, everyone. Here we are for week 2 of Introduction to Philosophy at the Oracle at Delphi, where Socrates' friend Chaerephon went to inquire about who is the wisest man, if there's anyone wiser than Socrates. And this has an interesting connection to our topic of discussion for this week, which is personal identity, and we're searching specifically for the principle of identity, or the principle of individuation, as we'll see. Inscribed famously on the Oracle at Delphi is the phrase translated to English, know thyself, or know yourself. Now for Socrates, to know yourself means precisely to know one's own limitations, to know, that is, that one does not know. But here we're really going to start asking, and this is the inauguration of that first unit of our course, which is centered on the question of selfhood or personal identity. We're really asking, what is that X that endures through time, that variable that we'll label X, enduring through time, that remains self-same and consistent despite various other alterations or changes? And one common approach to this question, one common way of answering it, is to suggest that personal identity or selfhood is a substance, that is some kind of thing. And there are various ways of articulating the kind of substance at issue. So by substance, I mean interchangeably at this point, thing, object, and so forth. And so one way to respond would be to say that what I am, what affixes itself to this pronoun I in every instance of its expression, is my body. Hence, personal identity amounts to bodily identity. Another way to respond is to say that the I is the soul. And in this case, we're talking about what philosophers call an immaterial substance. And we're going to look at some of these alternatives or candidates for responding to the problem of personal identity, searching for that principle of individuation today by way of John Perry's 1978 dialogue on personal identity and immortality. The primary or incipient question that instigates the discourse that follows, of which is the soul immortal? Another way to put that is it possible that I, or you, in the case of you posing this question for yourself, is it possible that I, whatever that I is, will survive my body's demise? Can I survive bodily death? And this question exposes the interlocutors, so Professor Gretchen Weyrob, a fictional, it should be noted, professor of philosophy. She finds herself in a hospital, suffering from injuries sustained from a motorcycle accident, and it's projected that due to these injuries, she's not going to live much longer, and so her friends are attempting to placate her, to assuage her fears, or really their own fears, about what happens upon bodily death. So the challenge that Weyrob poses to Miller is she wants him to show her how it's even possible, not probable at this point, that it's even possible in the strict logical sense that she will survive the destruction of her material body. And so we can define survival here. What would it mean to survive one's own bodily death? It would mean that there is someone for whom it would be appropriate for one to anticipate having future experiences. And so that's the futural direction. But looking back to the past, one could recollect who one was in the past and connect that figure to one's present instantiation in the world. So Sam Miller gives a few attempts, and the dialogue takes place over a series of days, 3 days. And today we're just going to talk about the first 2 days, and then I'll move into the theory of principle or excuse me, the principle of individuation, or the theory of personal identity as advanced by the 17th century British thinker John Locke. But Miller's first attempt, and this begins on page 2 of our reading, he maintains that this challenge, simply to show that it's possible that Gretchen Weyrob will survive her body's death, that the challenge is easily met. He says, you are here now, and then in the future, there is someone who is you. And so two people meet 1,000 years from now, and that would be a meeting presumably between Sam and Gretchen Weyrob, despite her having died 1,000 years previously. Now Weyrob responds, and this takes place over pages 2 and 3. How can I say that the future being will actually be me, or that I should anticipate having their experiences? And here's where we get the famous Kleenex box analogy. So imagine you have a Kleenex box in your house, and I set it on fire. I completely disintegrate it. I flush the remains down the toilet, and I tell you, however, when you go home later this evening, the very same Kleenex box will be there sitting on your shelf. And I don't mean a Kleenex box which is qualitatively similar, even if the similarity is quite exact between the new Kleenex box and the previous Kleenex box. So here we get a significant distinction to be made in the course of pursuing this question between numerical identity and qualitative identity. So when we're asking for the principle of individuation, or the source of personal identity, we're really asking about numerical identity. So for example, I have at my disposal beverages here. So here's some flavored seltzer water. So in terms of numerical identity, object A and object B are not, strictly speaking, the same, because they occupy different spaces, and those spaces are mutually exclusive, right? But in terms of qualitative identity, we can say that they are the same, meaning that they are interchangeable. So this is one can of seltzer water, and this is another can of seltzer water. They're both identical in every respect, so we say it's the same thing. But we're really looking for numerical identity, which means even in the case of identical twins, they are, to be quite precise, two separate individuals, although they share qualitatively many of the same properties or characteristics by which they can be identified or observed by others. So we're really looking for identity, not similarity, even if that similarity is quite precise or exact. So the problem of personal identity is, how do we identify one person at one time as that same person at another time? So Miller gives another attempt to answer this. He says, there's something special about us which makes us different from, say, a Kleenex box. Unlike Kleenex boxes, we have what philosophers and theologians call minds, or immaterial souls. And these are what allow us to track the consistency of identity over time. So to say that one person is identical to another is just to say to say that they have the same immaterial souls. Now Gretchen Weyrob responds in this way: how does one go about judging whether or not a person that we encounter has the same soul as a person that we encountered at some point previously? And this problem is especially pronounced given that these souls, a kind of substance, is presumed to be intangible. So I can notice your body if we were in a classroom, for instance, sitting in the same seat where I saw you a previous Tuesday, say, and I can make the deduction that I'm interacting with the same individual here. But if we don't have perceptual recourse, observational recourse to the thing that's supposed to be serving this principle, that is a soul, if it's nothing that I can see, smell, hear, or touch, well, how can I be so sure? So given the intangibility of souls, we cannot have any independent basis for establishing or confirming a correlation between a given soul and a given body. And so this means, even according to Miller's own perspective, that this principle whereby a soul is identified with a body is not knowable a priori. So let's take a look at the whiteboard here. This is a technical term that'll be very important as we proceed through the course. What does a priori mean? It's an epistemological term that means a kind of knowledge, specifically a knowledge that is independent of experience. So think, for instance, of a true proposition like 2 + 2 = 4. That sentence is true, and every time I want to verify its truth, I don't have to pick up 2 things over here and 2 things over here and add them and say, oh, right, 2 + 2 = 4. I don't need to rely upon my experience in order to justify that knowledge claim as something that I legitimately know. So next, Miller asks, well, why can't we use the psychological characteristics to judge the sameness of souls? So I know that someone is you, even if we're dealing with an individual at different moments in time, based on their personality. So characteristics that they manifest in their behavior and so forth. But Weyrob says, once again, psychological similarity does not amount to personal identity. What we need is the appropriate connection with a future self. Otherwise, we couldn't properly anticipate having their experiences, no matter how similar the states of mind could be. So we can imagine someone having identical psychological characteristics and personality traits, but perhaps our personalities are simply deeper than we ever expect, and we can often be surprised by people that we think we know very well. And so that doesn't quite work either. Next, we find an analogy with a river. What allows us to say a river is the same at this spatial point as it is when we travel north a little bit along its path and say there's a river at this spatial point. What remains importantly in place is that the river at one location and another location are appropriately connected. That is, the directionality of the flow connects one spatial point to another. Here's where we get a little more logic. So Weyrob responds here. If judgments about personal identity were grounded in judgments about the identities that we make in our observations of immaterial souls, then personal identity as such would be entirely mysterious. Because there's no evidence that we have to prefer the presumption that our body has but one soul attached to it, as opposed to alternative theories according to which our bodies are changing souls maybe as often as we change our clothes, right? And here's where we get the form modus tollens. So imagine S here stands for we judge personal identity by soul, and M is personal identity judgments are mysterious. So if we judge by the soul, something that we cannot ever observe, it would be entirely mysterious how it is that we're able to identify one person as the same as at one moment as they are at another. Premise 2, the way we make these judgments is not mysterious. Therefore,